All right, it is just past the top of the hour. We're learning new details about the mass shooting that took place inside a Boulder, Colorado grocery store. The suspected gunman has been charged with 10 counts of murder. So far, investigators have not commented on a possible motive, though law enforcement sources say at this point there is no evidence to suggest the shooting was an act of terror or a hate crime. Several law enforcement sources also say he may have had a history of mental health issues. Records show that this wasn't the suspect's first brush with the law. In 2017, he was charged with misdemeanor assault after attacking a high school classmate who, he said, had called him racial names. An arrest affidavit shows the suspect purchased an assault weapon on March 16th, just 6 days before the attack at the supermarket. A makeshift memorial is taking shape outside of the grocery store where the attack happened. The 10 victims range in age from 20 to 65 years old. They included 3 grocery store workers, several people who just happened to be shopping that afternoon, and a police officer who rushed to the scene. That slain officer, Eric Talley, was remembered yesterday by the Boulder police chief.
This officer had 7 children, ages 5 to 18. I just had that officer's whole family in my office 2 weeks ago to give him an award. I'll tell you that he's a very kind man, and he didn't have to go into policing. He had a profession before this, but he felt a higher calling. And he loved this community. And he's everything that policing deserves and needs. He was willing to die to protect others.
Here's President Biden yesterday speaking from the White House.
Jill and I are devastated, and the feeling, I just can't imagine how the families are feeling, the victims whose futures were stolen from them, from their families, from their loved ones, who now have to struggle to go on and try to make sense of what's happened. While we're still waiting for more information regarding the shooter, his motive, the weapons he used, the guns, the magazines, the weapons, the modifications that apparently have taken place to those weapons that are involved here, I don't need to wait another minute, let alone an hour, to take common sense steps that will save the lives in the future, and to urge my colleagues in the House and Senate to act. We can ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines in this country once again. I got that done when I was a senator. It passed. It was law for the longest time. And it brought down these mass killings. We should do it again. We can close the loopholes in our background check system, including the Charleston loophole. That's one of the best tools we have right now to prevent gun violence. The Senate should immediately pass, let me say it again, the United States Senate, I hope some are listening, should immediately pass the 2 House-passed bills that close loopholes in the background check system.
And of course, as we said last hour, what the president's talking about is the loophole that would have private gun sales. You would have to have background checks for that. Also, when you purchase weapons at gun shows. That is something that 88% of Americans support the closing of those loopholes. 82% of Republicans support the closing of those loopholes. And just one quick question, one quick clarification of language, and we've had it in our script twice now. Just to correct, they were not, whatever the gunman used, it is highly unlikely that he used an assault weapon. He certainly did not purchase an assault weapon from a gun shop. Assault weapons have been banned for decades now. What, as the New York Times has said, and the way we define it here, military-style semi-automatic weapons. Military-style semi-automatic weapons.
That's
I think a lot of times
about.
you say assault weapons in shorthand, but they are not, in fact, assault weapons. Military-style semi-automatic weapons.
Joining the conversation, we have former U.S. Senator, now on NBC News and MSNBC political analyst, Claire McCaskill. MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle joins us. and politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University, politics editor at The Grio, and an MSNBC political contributor, Jason Johnson. And the AP's Jonathan Lemire is still with us as well. Good to have you all with us.
All right, so Claire, we've been talking about there was a hearing yesterday on the Hill, some back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. It was a hearing that was actually set up before the shooting, so the timing, it had already been there. I want to circle back to something because you and I both represented conservative areas. You represented a conservative state. I represented a conservative congressional district, had a lot of hunters. In fact, most of my friends growing up in Baptist churches were hunters. And none of them that I've ever talked to have had a problem. And I can't think of one that I've talked to growing up. The people I grew up with in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Northwest Florida, upstate New York, none of them have ever had a problem with expanded background checks, with background checks at gun shows. So a terrorist can't just walk into a gun show like, you know, one of the Islamic terrorists that were on the FBI watch list a decade ago was saying, just go to gun shows, buy them there. There's no, you know, it's so lax, you can just get that and cause mayhem across the country. All of my friends that have grown up in a gun culture, they like background checks. They want to make sure that the people that have guns should be people who have the guns. 88% of Americans support that. 82% of Republicans support that. And yet here we find ourselves in a position that you've been in time and time again. Too many Republicans in the Senate just don't give a damn what 9 out of 10 Americans want. Just don't give a damn what 8 out of 10 Republicans want, which is expanded background checks.
We have the majority in the Senate. Now, it is a very razor-thin majority brought to us by a senator from a state where Donald Trump won by 40 points, and he did better in 2020 than he did in 2016. So, but we do have the majority, so we can make this vote happen. And by the way, Joe, we can make it happen over and over again. Repetition is the best friend of political success. If Chuck Schumer decides to put these bills on the floor and make Republicans vote for them, not once, but several times, to drive home the point how out of step Senator Kennedy and all the rest are. Yeah, and by the way, the folksy thing that Senator Kennedy does, I know some people think it's adorable, but let me just say this. Please give us the same restrictions on guns as we have on driving. Please. That's all. I mean, let's just do that. Let's just do that. Let's make what you've got to do to own a gun the same as what you've got to do to get a driver's license. If we are willing to take that baby step, at least that signals to America that we are uncomfortable being such an outlier in the world that embraces this kind of mayhem and murder of innocent citizens doing everyday tasks.
Yeah, Claire, you bring up a great point. I actually want to show that soundbite with Senator Kennedy where he has this folksy, deflecting attitude. But take a look at what he's saying. Listen.
What has happened in the last few days, what's happened in the last years, is, of course, tragic. And I'm not trying to perfectly equate these two, but we have a lot of drunk drivers in America that kill a lot of people. We ought to try to combat that too. But I think what many folks on my side of the aisle are saying is that the answer is not to get rid of all sober drivers. The answer is to concentrate on the problem.
Exactly. Jason Johnson, what we want to do is we want to focus on the problem drivers.
Thank you for bringing it up.
We want to focus on the people who are problematic, who would purchase guns. We want to focus on the people who may be able to purchase these guns at gun shows without any restrictions. Why is it that if I go buy a gun at a gun shop in my hometown, I go there, I look at the gun, I fill out the paperwork, they do the test, they do the check, it comes back eventually, and I get approved for that. But somebody else can just walk to a gun show, buy an AR-15 and walk out with no background check. That is insane. Conservative law enforcement officers think that is insane. Law enforcement officers who voted for Donald Trump think that is insane. 82% of 82% of Republicans, according to a 2019 Pew poll, think that is insane. And I think most would agree with Senator Kennedy. Yes, let's focus on the problem and let's put more safeguards in place, just like Mothers Against Drunk Driving did decades ago, because it made a real difference in keeping drunk drivers off the road. Maybe this would make a real difference in stopping people with mental challenges from getting their hands on guns.
Joe, here's the problem, though. The commitment by not just Senator Kennedy, but also, remember, Ted Cruz a year ago after El Paso, he's a Senator Cornyn, Texas, El Paso. The commitment to guns on the part of a lot of these public officials, a lot of these senators, it's not about policy. It's not about safety. They just have a religious commitment to guns. That's it. Because you're right. The numbers have not been on their side for years. The death numbers, the violence numbers have said that we need to do something. The fact that Republicans, gun owners, Democrats, regular people have all said, hey, look, we're not anti-gun. We just think somebody should be, forced to prove they're remotely responsible before they have them. You should be able to make sure that the person buying the gun isn't crazy. But here's the thing, Joe, and this is ultimately where I sort of differ even with the people who just say background checks. At the end of the day, from what we know so far, right, with the individual who just committed this shooting in Boulder, what we know about the individual who committed the violence in Atlanta, what we know about so many of the individuals who commit these acts of violence, they don't necessarily have egregious criminal records. There was no indicator that this guy was a terrorist. So it's not just going to be enough to do background checks, because a background check wouldn't necessarily have stopped this guy. All he has is one sort of assault thing. So we need to think about the larger issue of what kind of weaponry people can get access to. Because what we've seen over and over again is the men, primarily men, who are engaging these acts don't have some long, obvious history that says, I'm a terrorist or I'm going to go shoot up a grocery store. They're loners. They're living below the radar. They're going from job to job. They may or may not be living at their mother's house. So it's not just identifying and tracking those people. It's limiting what they can get access to. There's a big difference between being able to use a semi-automatic weapon to shoot up a store versus something that you got to reload and reload and reload.
Public polling, as we've been discussing, public polling, Joe, as we've been discussing this morning, obviously is in favor of a lot of these measures. And Mike Barnicle, great to see you, by the way, right here. I want to talk to you about President Biden and his appetite for this, his drive for gun control. You know the president well. You know his staff. We know his record on guns. We saw that he stood next to President Obama the day of the Newtown, the Sandy Hook shooting, and how emotional that was for both men. What can he do now? What's the appetite now? We've been talking about how ambitious his agenda is. There's going to be a lot of Republican pushback. How big do you think Biden can go on guns?
You know, Jonathan, that's an interesting question, because President Biden is, when you strip away the title and everything, he is a normal human being. And I think he is tired of the makeshift memorials. I think he is tired of crying about over 26 or 27 children being killed at Sandy Hook. I think he's tired of people, young people, who instead of going to graduation at Parkland High School, went to funerals. I think he's tired of all of that, the same as many Americans are tired of that. And I think he's specifically tired of the fact that his former colleagues, as he calls them, don't have the courage to stand up to whatever. The gun lobby is no longer the power it used to be. To stand up and enact, at a minimum, background checks that encompass a period of time where, as Jason pointed out, you can't filter everyone out. Someone who appears to be normal, 3-7 days waiting period, they're going to get a gun, but maybe the gun that they get will be, as Jason just pointed out, a revolver and not a semi-automatic weapon. I think he's tired of all of that. The country is tired of all of that. They're tired of hearing people like Ted Cruz stand up on the floor of the Senate and lie, just patently lie to the American public about gun legislation. And they're specifically tired of people like Senator Kennedy, Senator Cornpone, in this folksy manner of his, who just twists and turns the truth of this. And the truth of this is that the United States Senate does not have the courage to do something that the vast majority of Americans want done. And I think President Biden is right in line with that. Get it done.
Yesterday, Jonathan Chait wrote a great article at New York Magazine talking about the racial background behind the filibuster. This morning, Kevin Cruz has really boiled it down to its essence. So please forgive me, this might take a minute, but I know you'll want to hear this list. From Kevin Cruz, this is when the filibuster was used. Filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill in 1874, filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill in 1875, filibuster against pension for black officials in 1906, filibuster against confirmation of a black official in 1909, filibuster against anti-lynching bill 1921, filibuster against anti-lynching bill 1922, filibuster against anti-lynching bill 1925, filibuster against monument to black World War I veterans 1926, filibuster against anti-lynching bill 1935, filibuster against anti-lynching bill 1938, filibuster against bill targeting racial discrimination in employment 1945, filibuster against Truman's civil rights proposals 1948, filibuster against Truman's civil rights proposals 1949, filibuster against Truman's civil rights proposal 1950, filibuster against measures to fight housing discrimination 1954, filibusters against civil rights bill 1957, filibuster against civil rights bill 1960, filibuster against civil rights bill 1962, filibuster against civil rights bill 1963, filibuster against civil rights bill 1964, civil rights bill filibuster against civil rights bill 1966, filibuster against civil rights bill 1968, filibuster against bill targeting employment discrimination 1972, filibuster against civil rights bill 1976, filibuster against extension of voting rights bill 1982, filibuster against creation of MLK Day federal holiday 1983, filibuster against civil rights bill 1984. I can go on.
Fantastic.
So when
yes, you can.
So this really does. For those who say that the filibuster does not have an anti-civil rights overtone to it, it's just not true.
Oh, Joe, it's not just not true. And Kevin Cruz, I read his thread. It was fantastic. Michael Harriot also had a very clear. It's clear that the filibuster is primarily used to stop black people from being able to enjoy all that this country supposedly has to offer. That's clear. That's obvious. Whether it's civil rights or pensions. I mean, the MLK holiday is ridiculous. That seems archaic now. But yes, someone was actually trying to filibuster giving Martin Luther King a holiday. The issue to me is not that there's a racial component to the filibuster. There's a racial component to almost everything in this country. That's not surprising. Anyone who knows history, anyone who pays attention knows that's the case. What galls me, actually, Joe, what I find surprising, whether it's Manchin or Sinema or the current president of the United States, is I don't understand how their support for the filibuster comes against self-interest. Because at the end of the day, if the Democrats can't pass anything, even though they have the majority in the Senate, they will lose in 2022, and then they'll lose in 2024. So regardless of whatever kind of schoolhouse rock mythological affection that you have for the filibuster, the practical reality is if some of these laws don't get passed, if the Democrats can't do something about voting rights, if the Democrats can't pass the John Lewis Civil Rights Act, first off, some of them are not going to have their jobs in 2022, but they also won't be able to pass policy. And that's the thing that shocks me most. Racism in America has almost never been a motivator for the Senate, certainly not in a positive way. But self-interest, I need to be able to pass something to keep my job, should be a motivator. It does not make any sense to me why they're fighting it. But again, I'll say this quickly. It's also why I think at the end of the day, Joe Manchin will flip, because he wants to appear to be a historic person to help some of these laws get passed.
Well, and you know, Jason, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask you if you agreed with me from the very beginning of this. I said, let's just do some reverse engineering here. There is no way Joe Manchin can stand in the way. There is no way Kyrsten Sinema can stand in the way of H.R. 1 or the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, unless I'm completely stunned. Let's do reverse engineering. They're going to have to figure out a way to pass John Lewis's voting rights bill, and they're going to have to figure out a way to pass at least a modified version of H.R. 1, aren't they?
Joe, I completely agree with you. And I've said this before. I say this the most affectionate way possible. No insult to Claire or any members. But, you know, the Senate's full of a lot of divas. These people, if you're not going to be president, they certainly want to go down in history. And nothing would serve Kristen Sinema or Manchin's ego more than to be the critical swing votes that make sure that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act gets passed. They will go down in everybody's history books or history pads in the future as being the person that made sure this happened. Everybody wants their John McCain moment. So I think in this particular issue, they're going to pretend that they have issues. He's going to grumble. He's like, I don't know. I don't like this. I don't like the font, et cetera, et cetera. But I think on this particular issue, they will end up flipping. Now, does that mean that they're going to abolish the filibuster? No. But does that mean that they'd be open to reforms to take it back to what it used to be, where you actually have to stand there, where you actually have to have the minority come up with votes as opposed to stop the majority? I think that reform will eventually happen because there's too much of a carrot out there. There's too much of an opportunity to put yourself at the center of American history for Manchin or Sinema to pass up on.